We're back for another couple stories here. So this is a story that happened at the Sunnyside mill, right here. Really a big mill. So the caption on that picture is, "From anywhere in Eureka you could see the Sunnyside mill. Judge John Terry had the knowledge of how to build a mill. The first mill was built below the southern edge of Lake Emma, 4 miles above Eureka, in 1888. Wrong spot. The next mill was built by Terry at Midway. The third mill, and the first one in Eureka, is at the left in this photo with the tram house at the top. And the last one was built in 1918, a large one, a 500-ton per day selective flotation mill, the first of its kind in the United States. Only the concrete foundation stretching up the hillside remain today." So it was all, the ore came in entirely by tramway, so aerial tramway. So this story is called "Accidents Are for Keeps." The ambulance wailed like a banshee with a toothache as it came up behind me, and I had to pull off to the side to let it go racing by. It was easy to imagine the scene inside the gleaming vehicle. The accident victim secure on a stretcher, wrapped in blankets to stave off the chill of shock, well-trained medics standing by with oxygen, plasma, and a hypo if needed. These men and women with their equipment are angels of mercy in this accident-prone, speed-crazed world. I knew a time when I would have given anything for a little of their attention and skill. Back in the summer of 1926, I had a job as mill hand at one of the large lead zinc mines of southwestern Colorado. The Sunnyside. Not the Sunnyside, the Terry Mill at Eureka. The Sunnyside Mill. A good job for a youngster just a year or two out of high school. One morning, shortly after going on shift, I was badly mauled in an accident at the company's mill. The memory of the long ordeal I endured has not faded through the years. A steel brace I wear strapped to my back never lets me forget. It happened a little before noon while I was working the table floor, the lowest floor in the mill, taking samples and oiling the machinery, just routine duty. One of my chores was the care of a long overhead line shaft driven by a large electric motor. The shaft in turn drove 12 willfully concentrating tables by means of wide rubber transmission belts. The installation was a constant source of trouble and demanded so much work and attention that I hated the thing, but it had to be maintained. Working along from table to table, I noticed a stench of burning oil, always a sure warning of trouble up the line shaft. Over near the motor drive end, a journal was smoking hot. In order to get to it with my oil can and tools, I had to scramble up an old 2x4 ladder. Mill superintendents and shift bosses took a dim view of shutdowns for repairs because of burned out equipment. So I tried to adjust and lubricate the journal and get it to cool off while the shaft was still running. Perhaps it was carelessness on my part or just plain disregard for the danger, but somehow in turning to climb down, I snagged my overalls right across the small of my back, and they started to wind around the shaft. Lashed to the shaft by my own clothes, I would be beaten to a pulp in seconds. It turned at 250 RPM. For me, the chips were down. In the split second before it dragged me from the ladder, I grabbed for something to try and pull myself free and managed to get hold of a water pipe with my left hand. Crazy with fear and pain, I fought that spinning bar of steel like a maniac, pitting my strength against the power of the motor in a grim tug of war. If I won, I lived. If I lost, I died. But manpower is no match for horsepower, and the strain almost tore my arm from the shoulder before it broke my grip on the pipe. Totally helpless, I started to spin with the shaft's rotation, and I knew I'd never escape the whirling, smashing death just seconds away. There happened to be enough space between the line shaft and the cement wall so my head didn't strike as I made the first turns. My clothes began to rip away, and the thing peeled me out of them clean as a skinned rabbit. It hurled me against the cement wall with catapult force, and I fell to the floor 12 feet below. Even my socks were ripped off, although the white rubber mill shoes were still on my feet. I've never been able to understand how this could happen, but it did. Every stitch of clothing I'd worn formed a tight wad wrapped around the shaft. Take a break for a relight. Now in these mills, sidebar, the ore comes in at the top and then is crushed and separated in sequential steps as it sidesteps down the hill. So he was at the lowest level where the tables were taking this very fine powder and separating them again with shaking tables. Stunned and only partly conscious, I didn't realize I lay on the floor in the slime and muck, still alive. I couldn't move, get my breath, or feel a thing. I didn't seem to have a body anymore, just a head. And the thought came to me that possibly all but my head was a mangled mess wound up in the machinery. I wanted desperately to get up, just to prove I could stand on my feet. If I could do that, then my head and body were still attached. Finally, I managed it and made a try for the stairs to the mill office on the floor above. But I staggered against a pulsating table deck. It struck me in the side and I went out cold. A dim and bleary world greeted me when consciousness returned. The paralysis in my belly and chest had eased some. To be alive and lying there in the table spillage with a little air in my lungs was a wonderful relief. I crawled over to the steps and sat, trying to take stock of myself. Then the pain came, so intense it made me sick. From my shoulders and back it seemed to flow in sheets to every part of my body. My left arm hung useless from the shoulder, and it had swollen so badly it scared me. My legs were not much better off either, but at least I could move them. Blood dripped from my nose, mouth, and a dozen deep lacerations. I kept trying to get things in sharper focus, not realizing both eyes were black and almost closed. A lot of skin had been burned away by my clothes when the shaft stripped me. Slowly I began to understand I'd been seriously injured. I rested a few minutes and then faced the long flight of steps and started up. I panicked with the thought of falling back down again, but kept telling myself, just a few more steps and you'll have it made. Those steps took a lot of doing. Finally, when I staggered through the office door, the mill superintendent got the shock of his life. He all but fell over backwards out of his chair. "My God, kid, what happened to you?" he yelled. Then he started firing questions without waiting for an answer. After he'd calmed down a little, I tried to tell him, but I don't think I made much sense. He phoned for a relief operator to come out and take my place. The operation of the mill was always uppermost in his mind. Chris, my shift boss, came in about then, and I had to tell him what I thought had happened, all the while standing naked in the middle of the floor. He and the mill super just stood and gaped at me in astonishment. They couldn't think of a thing to do, and I was getting pretty lightheaded. Chris came out of it first and rustled up a pair of old bib overalls and a jumper. "Here, put 'em on, kid," he said. "You look like the wrong end of a butcher shop." I couldn't get into them, so he helped me and then took some wet wiping waste and did what he could to clean up my face. They thought it best I take the stage to town and have the doc at the company hospital look me over. Chris walked with me to the main office to make sure I got there. "You better wait here. Kelly will be along with the stage soon," he said, "and have the doctor take a good look at those cuts as well as your arm." Chris figured he'd done all he could for me and hurried back to the mill. I didn't want to go into the office and sit down. I didn't want anyone to see me, so I waited outside and held onto the handrail to keep from falling. By the time Kelly pulled up in the old touring car he used for a stage, things were getting pretty vague. But that helped a lot as I eased myself onto the front seat, and I prayed I'd never have to move again. Kelly was everyone's friend as well as mine. "What happened to you?" he asked. "You fall off the mountain or something?" I couldn't tell him much about the accident, and it miffed him a little. He took a long, hard look at me, but didn't say anything more and went about his business, delivering the stage freight to the mill. Then we drove over to the post office for the outgoing mail. A time-consuming task. Kelly never pulled away from a stop without a complete rundown on the local gossip. After the post office, he headed for the company boarding house. "Come on in and have a cup of coffee. You look like you need it, and it's on the house," he said. I'll have to see if the cook wants anything from town. I stayed in the car, trembling uncontrollably from chills and shock. I wanted a cup of coffee like nothing else in the world right then, but the price I'd have to pay in pain to get it was too high. When Kelly finally had all his details attended to, we went rattling down the canyon road to town, a long 9 miles away. He did his best to miss the rocks and chuckles, but I know he hit every one of them. Nauseated and weak, I chewed my lips, squinted my eyes, and hung on. Shortly after we'd make a stop at a small hamlet to pick up the mail, Kelly redeemed himself. He gave me a drink of good bootleg whiskey from his bottle. It was a julep from heaven. We made our last stop at a crossroad post office, and when Kelly came out with the mail sacks, he said we had to make room for a lady passenger. He guessed I'd better get in the back seat. Somehow, with his help, I made the switch and climbed into the tonneau. It took a little time for the lights to stop flashing in my eyes and for me to quit swearing from the pain of moving about. Kelly hadn't mentioned that a lady lived up a side road a mile or so. Our passenger came out to the stage wearing her finery and a big smile. A trip to town on a bright summer day was no small event. Remember, this is 1926. Kelly, the gallant, grinned his welcome and held the door for her. She glanced up and saw me. Stifling a scream, she backed away from the car. I must have been a sight, perched up on the freight and mail sacks, dressed in dirty old overalls, both eyes black and blood oozing from my nose and mouth. Trying to wipe it away only made it worse. If Kelly hadn't assured her I was harmless, I think she would have run back to the house. Poor woman, I spoiled her trip. She sat on the very front edge of the seat, as close to the dash as she could, all the way to town. Kelly brought the stage in late as usual. He'd run out of road, but not errands. First he saw the lady to her destination. Before he could open the door for her, she'd taken another look at me and fled. Naturally, the post office was the next stop. It had priority and was the terminal for the stage line. "No need for you to walk over to the doctor," he said. "I have to drive by that way, and you may as well ride." A very friendly and considerate gesture on Kelly's part. He let me out in front of the hospital and drove off. From the sidewalk, I looked up at the second flight of stairs I'd faced that day. These were wide and not so high, but the steps seemed to be moving up and down in waves, and there was no handrail to hold on to. I wondered how in the world I'd climb up. I thought perhaps if I spoke to them softly, as a person would to a frightened or excited animal, they'd hold still. It worked, and I climbed up the door and made my way inside. Later, one of the boys who was gold bricking in the hospital said a nurse found me standing in the hallway corner, chattering and shivering like a scared monkey. The pain in my body had been building intensity all the time. I was far from rational, and I didn't want anyone near for fear they might touch me. I received the first pain-killing shot 3.5 hours after the accident. And when they'd finished with the necessary stitching and patching, I resembled a mummy more than a man. I couldn't walk or move without help. They'd strapped me to a plank, and I learned to know that piece of lagging very well indeed. My score for the day was a broken back, a left arm all but yanked off my shoulder, some badly cracked ribs, and several joints that still give me some trouble. Sewing up the cuts, the bruises, and the skin I'd lost don't count. In time, they built a steel frame to keep my back in line with my hips and shoulders, and I get along fine. And friend, you there in the racing ambulance, too bad you were hurt. But since you were, you're in luck in that vehicle. There was a time equipment like that and trained personnel to man it didn't exist. For the unfortunate, the going was tough. One thing hasn't changed much, though. We still learn the hard way that accidents are for keeps. This one is called The Old Man. Another story from Lewis Wyman's Snowflakes and Quartz. Every resident mine manager is known as the Old Man. Age has nothing to do with it. It's a title bestowed by the crew, whether they like him or not. It always carried a note of respect for his authority. His signature on the paycheck backs it up. In the early days of the Shenandoah mine, the machine crew machine shop crew at the mill became used to the old man coming and going through the shop. It was the shortest way between mill and general offices. Often he'd stop and comment on whatever work was in progress. There was very little that went on about the plant and mine he wasn't well informed on. Most of our side activities he chose to ignore, but when he found something he couldn't tolerate, he'd come down hard on us. He was recognized throughout the Southwest as one of the best managers in the business, and on matters of policy, most everyone figured he was reasonably fair. The shop crew at the mill developed a little sideline, a kind of good neighbor thing, that just seemed to have sprung up by itself. There was no money in it. The miners on their way to work in the morning would leave some household gadget in the shop to be mended. Then they'd pick it up after shift on their way home. Quite often, when we came to work, we'd find a youngster's toy tucked away behind the toolbox or under a workbench. Bicycles, tricycles, little red wagons, and even a little girl's doll buggy came our way. With each toy came a silent plea. "Please, mister, will you fix it for me?" We had to keep the stuff out of sight as much as possible, even though we suspected the old man knew all about our sideline. We watched his comings and goings, and when he went to the mine on inspection trips, we'd pull up our backlog of toys and try to get caught up with our work. So the Shenandoah was, sidebar, was halfway up the mountain, well, more than halfway, up against these cliffs. You had to ride a tramway to get there. So it was, you were there for the whole morning or the whole afternoon if you're going to take a little visit up there. One day a new angle developed. I glanced up from my work and saw a woman standing in the doorway. She seemed unsure as to whether she should come in or not, so I went over to see if we could help her in some way. She said her husband worked at the mine. They thought if she brought their little boy's leg brace in, somebody might be able to fix it for him. She handed me one of those monstrosities of bent iron and leather straps which doctors and technicians use to harness kids crippled from polio. The shop crew got to know that brace and its owner, Tommy, quite well. He was a rough one, 12 years old, and he'd try anything. Though his leg must have given him real pain at times, I never heard him whimper. Bicycles, basketball, baseball, or anything else where the action was fast was just his meat. Sometimes we almost gave up trying to keep him on two legs. It got so I thought leather and iron weren't strong enough to hold him. To Tommy, the world was a great big wonderful place to have fun in, and a leg brace, no handicap at all. On one occasion he came limping into the shop, climbed up on the workbench, and informed me I broke it. So what's new about that? I fell off a burro. He was running fast, but I didn't hurt my other leg. Well, in that case, we should be able to get you back on two legs again. What are you planning to do, ride in Labor Day parade? It happened that the old man was on a trip to the mine and would be gone for a time, so we didn't have him to worry about. The shop welder mended the broken part for us. Then Tommy and I clamped it on the bench vise while we finished it off and fitted a new pin to the hinge joint. For convenience sake, I kept Tommy perched up on a box on the workbench so I could find him when the job was finished. He always gave me a rundown on important events and could ask questions about everything he saw in the shop and mill faster than I could answer them. Suddenly he fell silent. I turned to see what had attracted his attention. The old man stood back of me, taking in the whole performance. Well, I thought, here we go, caught at the scene of the crime. Are you repairing the lad's leg brace? I told him I was and introduced Tommy. The old man shook hands with him and addressed him with the full title of Mr. Tommy sat up straight on his box and grew an inch or two. Louis, the old man said, spare no effort. Do the very best job on that brace you can. Then he shook hands with Tommy, said goodbye, and went back to his office. Yes, the old man was boss. He hired and fired. He carried the weight of responsibility for a big outfit on his shoulders, but he could still find time to be concerned about a little boy with his leg in a brace. Damn it. The story gets me. Smoking some more of that McClellan's Oriental. This is the Venice Algonia. I would be interested to see what that this stuff goes for, a tin of it, on eBay. It would be a lot, I think. It's a good mild smoker. Do I have the tin? No, I didn't bring it out. So this one is called Kids and Trams, Oil and Water. Gerald Swanson, Jim Drobnik, and Mike Mays were together in junior high school in 1942 in Silverton. A special summer adventure for the boys would be to hike up from town to Arastra Gulch to the Shenandoah Dives mine. Throughout the Depression and over the years, out-of-work miners would make the same hike hoping to rustle a job. Even if there was no work, they always would be fed and might even enjoy a hot shower. This was the custom, and these facts were known far and wide. Such was the goodness of mine manager Charles Chase to the men. Well, the boys knew this too, and would conveniently time their arrival to catch the noontime meal. After the miners had finished, Mrs. Carey would serve the boys some sandwiches and always some pie. Dot's Pies had a regional reputation. Afterwards, the trio would help Bill Smith at the stub tram, loading and unloading supplies for the commissary and the boarding house. Things like candy, punch boards, clothing, clocks and radios, sometimes jewelry, and of course all kinds of good food. At the commissary, there was a pool table and a snooker table, and the boys might shoot a couple of games. Maybe they'd enjoy a cold pop from the boozeless bar. The afternoon would pass too quickly for the boys, and much more slowly the shift would end for the miners. Usually the single guys lived at the boarding house, but the married men who lived in town would let the boys jump in the buckets and with them for the ride down to the mill, the road, and the way back home. The miners would make the boys duck down and hide from John and Joe Arrieta on duty at the bottom of the tram. The kids would jump out smartly as the bucket came round the bowl wheel and run out the side of the building, usually with John or Joe's cuss words ringing in their ears. And in a couple weeks, it would be time to go again. Remember, those trams, sidebar, were like ski lifts. So they had a big wheel down at the bottom and at the top. And so, very much like a ski lift. So, now one day, those young but experienced tram riders were walking the road back to town when a Ford station wagon pulled up next to them. Remember, this is 1942. Mr. Chase himself was driving it. "Hop in, boys, I'll give you a ride." It wasn't like he was asking, so in they went. Mr. Chase drove ever so slowly, expounding all the while on a particular problem that was occurring at the mine. "You know, young men, there are some people riding our tram who have no business doing so. They've been doing it a lot over the past couple of summers." Gerald, Jim, and Richard snuck furtive glances at each other. "Now, it's not right. It's against all regulations, and it's dangerous. If these people were to be foolish enough to keep it up, they will get into serious trouble." No direct accusations, no names, just a long, entirely one-sided conversation. The boys were relieved to see the drugstore come into view. "We'll get off here, Mr. Chase. Thank you, sir, for the ride," they said as they jumped out and started to shut the door. But Mr. Chase had leaned over and was keeping it open. He looked solemnly at each one of the boys. "You do understand what I mean, boys, don't you?" We nodded our heads vigorously, not knowing what to say. We didn't ride the tram again that summer. And next year, we only rode it maybe a couple of times. And that was it. Back again. This time for a more modern story. So there's, I think, a widely held belief that women in mines are unlucky. So this article by Lois Mackenzie, who I knew in Silverton. She was tough, but really a great person. The tradition of women being bad luck underground had its roots in 17th century mining, when women and children had to work underground to keep the families fed. Few lives were considered important enough to be spared the grueling hours, deadly air, and extremely dangerous ground conditions. It took a century and a half to improve conditions enough, both in the outside economy and underground, so that women didn't have to go under. So when a woman would show up for work, something almost instinctive would ring an alarm deep in the hearts of miners, reminding them of watching their women and children dying with sweating, blackened faces bent over from the work. When I worked in the mine, I almost had the impression the men liked having women underground. This was in the 80s, 70s and 80s, 1980s. It somehow reassured them if we would work there, conditions must not be all that bad. I don't remember anyone underground ever even alluding to the women are bad luck underground tale. For the most part, the men didn't harass me any more than they harassed each other. Whenever anyone new came underground, the guys would push until they found the person's breaking point. If that point was too close to the surface, they would drive the person out of the mine. It was a sort of survival mechanism. If pushing past the breaking point was easy, the person might not hold up in a real emergency, and everyone knew their life may someday depend on the guy sitting next to them. I watched the men drive one gal nearly nuts, and I decided if I was going to stay, I better watch my own step. I didn't invite sexually oriented jokes or relationships, and I ran the hoist. Now, a hoist operator, hoist man in the old days, is sort of like a doctor or a cook in that you really don't want to piss them off. So when somebody got rude, I just remind them who was taking them to E-level, or ask them if they wanted their feet wet in the bottom of the shaft, and they usually straightened right up. Even though I threatened, I never really messed around with the hoist. Too many of them had had close calls, serious accidents, or lost friends in hoisting wrecks. Threats were generally effective enough. One time only did I really scare anybody. It was the two guys who had just driven the other girl out of the mine. She had been working for them, and they were on a roll. I was sent in to replace her. They got rude, and after a few days began to get to me. So when they stepped on this work deck out in front of me, I released the brake, letting them free fall for about 6 feet. Then I slammed on the brake. Their saucer-shaped eyes bounced right at deck level. I asked them if they were through. They indicated they were, and I never had a lick of trouble out of either of them again. They were known as the Fan Brothers. One would suck and one would blow. They're both dead now. The mines took one, and an unknown blood disorder took the other. I deeply respected them both. It's from Lois Mackenzie. So here's the smoking shed on a rainy Sunday afternoon.